technique of acting which produces an alienation effect. From Brecht On Theater, translated by John Willett, read by Vincent Bagnall. What follows represents an attempt to describe a technique of acting which was applied in certain theaters, with a view to taking the incidents portrayed and alienating them from the spectator. The aim of this technique, known as the alienation effect, was to make the spectator adopt an attitude of inquiry and criticism in his approach to the incident. The means were artistic. The first condition for the alienation effect's application to this end is that stage and auditorium must be purged of everything magical, and that no hypnotic tensions should be set up. This ruled out any attempt to make the stage convey the flavor of a particular place, a room at evening, a road in the autumn, or to create atmosphere by relaxing the tempo of the conversation. The audience was not worked up by a display of temperament or swept away by acting with tautened muscles. In short, no attempt was made to put it in a trance and give it the illusion of watching an ordinary, unrehearsed event. The audience's tendency to plunge into such illusions has to be checked by specific artistic means.
Sie bewegen sich. Guck mal, der Raum wird kleiner. Schnell, gib das Passwort ein.
Conversation with Bertolt Brecht. Am I wrong in regarding you as both a poet and a playwright? My poetry is more private. It's designed for banjo or piano accompaniment. It needs to be performed dramatically. In my plays, I don't just give my own private mood, but also the whole world's. In other words, an objective view of the business, the opposite of mood in the usual poetic sense. This isn't always clear from performances of your plays. How could it be? They are usually performed all wrong. People perform the poet. They imagine me to be something I hardly am outside my plays, and certainly not in them. So you reject the idea that the author participates poetically in the characters and events he portrays, and whatever may consequently come to be expressed in the play. I don't let my feelings intrude in my dramatic work. I'd give a false view of the world. I aim at an extremely classical, cold, highly intellectual style of performance. I'm not writing for the scum who want to have the cockles of their hearts want. Who do you write for? For the sort of people who just come for fun and don't hesitate to keep their hats on in the theater. But most spectators want their hearts to flow over. The one tribute we can pay the audience is to treat it as thoroughly intelligent. It is utterly wrong to treat people as simpletons when they are grown up at 17. I appeal to the reason, but the intellectual mastery of the material is just what I sometimes feel to be lacking with you. You don't make the incidents clear. I give the incidents baldly, so that the audience can think for itself. That's why I need a quick-witted audience that knows how to observe and gets its enjoyment from setting its reason to work. So you don't want to make things easy for the audience. The audience has got to be a good enough psychologist to make its own sense of the material I put before it. All I can guarantee is the absolute correctness and authenticity of what happens in my plays. I am prepared to bank on my knowledge of human beings, but I leave the maximum freedom of interpretation. The sense of my plays is imminent. You have to fish it out for yourself. There can't be any objection to an actor making the material immediately intelligible, though, as against your way of doing things. There are writers who simply set down what happened. I'm one of them. My material is intelligible. I don't first have to make it so. There are other writers who not only put down what happened, but give a theoretical explanation as a separate element. And then there's a third way of going about things, which aims at the mutual fusion of live material and conceptual analysis. To my mind, only the first approach suits the dramatic form. Certainly, but sometimes it can confuse the audience. They lose the thread of the material. If so, then it's the fault of the modern theater, which takes anything that would repay analysis and plays it for its mystic meaning. Do you mean that it's not only the author, but the producer too, who has to make the dramatic sequence of events intelligible? For the period of the performance, yes, proper plays can only be understood when performed. But we've got to get away from the prevailing muzziness, even from monumental muzziness. The height of muzziness is bad posters. I am for the epic theater. The production has got to bring out the material incidents in a perfectly sober and matter-of-fact way. Nowadays, the play's meaning is usually blurred by the fact that the actor plays to the audience's hearts. The figures portrayed are foisted on the audience and are falsified in the process. Contrary to present custom, they ought to be presented quite coldly, classically, and objectively, for they are not matter for empathy. They are there to be understood. Feelings are private and limited. Against that, the reason is fairly comprehensive and to be relied on. That's uncompromising intellectualism. It's a great thing, to my mind, not to have given in to the anti-intellectual fashions of recent years. Maybe, at any rate, I am not so discouragingly chaotic as people think. I may confine my plays to the raw material, but I show only what is typical. I select, that is where discipline comes in. Even when a character behaves by contradictions, that's only because nobody can be identically the same at two unidentical moments. Changes in his exterior continually lead to an inner reshuffling. The continuity of the ego is a myth. A man is an atom that perpetually breaks up and forms anew. We have to show things as they are. But what this amounts to is an intellectual confirmation of the confused state of the real world. And you have reached it. By using my head, the confusion itself only exists because our head is an imperfect instrument. What's beyond it we call the irrational. I'd like to ask you what you're working on at the moment. I've got two things on. The first is a biography of Samson Corner. Why that? Samson Corner is a splendid type and a significant one. I wanted to get him down on paper for myself. The best way was to make him tell me his life story. I have a high regard for reality. Not that there are many realities like Samson Corner. They are windfalls. The first thing that struck me about Samson was that the sporting principle underlying his boxing seemed un-German. he boxed in a matter-of-fact way. There's great plastic charm in that. It's quite impossible, for instance, to imitate Samson Corner putting a bus ticket in his pocket. That's why he's also a considerable cinema actor. How do you go to work? It's more a pleasure than work. I ask him to talk to me, and I've a high regard for his views. People's opinions interest me far more than their feelings. Feelings are usually the product of opinions. They follow on. But opinions are decisive. Only experience sometimes ranks higher. So we all know that not every opinion stems from experience. That's pure intellectualism. Again, every act comes from a realization. There's really no such thing as acting on impulse. There again, the intellect is lurking in the background. And what else are you working at? A comedy called Man ist Mann. It's about a man being taken to pieces and rebuilt as someone else for a particular purpose. And who does the rebuilding? 3 engineers of the feelings. Is the experiment a success? Yes, and they are, all of them, much relieved. Does it produce the perfect human being? Not specially.
Und diese Leute, wir sind hier alle zusammen.
The first condition for the achievement of the alienation effect is that the actor must invest what he has to show with a definite jest of showing. It is, of course, necessary to drop the assumption that there is a fourth wall cutting the audience off from the stage and the consequent illusion that the stage action is taking place in reality and without an audience. That being so, it is possible for the actor in principle to address the audience direct. It is well known that contact between audience and stage is normally made on the basis of empathy. Conventional actors devote their efforts so exclusively to bringing about this psychological operation that they may be said to see it as the principal aim of their art. Our introductory remarks will already have made it clear that the technique which produces an alienation effect is the exact opposite of that which aims at empathy. The actor applying it is bound not to try to bring about the empathy operation. Yet in his efforts to reproduce particular characters and show their behavior, he need not renounce the means of empathy entirely. He uses these means, just as any normal person with no particular acting talent would use them, if he wanted to portray someone else. For example, show how he behaves. This showing of other people's behavior happens time and time again in ordinary life. Witnesses of an incident demonstrating to newcomers how the victim behaved, or a facetious person imitating a friend's walk, etc., without those involved making the least effort to subject their spectators to an illusion. At the same time, they do feel their way into their characters' skins with a view to acquiring their characteristics. As has already been said, the actor too will make use of this psychological operation. But whereas the usual practice in acting is to execute it during the actual performance in the hope of stimulating the spectator into a similar operation, he will achieve it only at an earlier stage, at some time during rehearsals. To safeguard against an unduly impulsive, frictionless, and uncritical creation of characters and incidents, more reading rehearsals can be held than usual. The actor should refrain from living himself into the part prematurely in any way, and should go on functioning as long as possible as a reader, which does not mean a reader aloud. An important step is memorizing one's first impressions. When reading his part, the actor's attitude should be one of a man who is astounded and contradicts not only the occurrence of the incidents as he reads about them, but the conduct of the man he is playing as he experiences it. It must be weighed up by him and their peculiarities understood. None can be taken as given, as something that was bound to turn out that way, that was only to be expected from a character like that. Before memorizing the words, he must memorize what he felt astounded at, and where he felt impelled to contradict. For these are dynamic forces that he must preserve in creating his performance. When he appears on the stage, besides what he actually is doing, he will at all essential points discover, specify, imply what he is not doing. That is to say, he will act in such a way that the alternative emerges as clearly as possible, that his acting allows the other possibilities to be inferred, and only represents one out of the possible variants. He will say, for instance, "You'll pay for that," and not say, "I forgive you." He detests his children. It is not the case that he loves them. He moves down stage left and not up stage right. Whatever he doesn't do must be contained and conserved in what he does. In this way, every sentence and every gesture signifies a decision. The character remains under observation and is tested. The technical term for this procedure is fixing the not but. The actor does not allow himself to become completely transformed on the stage into the character he's portraying. He is not Lear, Harpagon, Schweik, he shows them. He reproduces their remarks as authentically as he can. He puts forward their way of behaving to the best of his abilities and knowledge of men. But he never tries to persuade himself, and thereby others, that this amounts to a complete transformation. Actors will know what it means if I say that a typical kind of acting without this complete transformation takes place when a producer or colleague shows one how to play a particular passage. It is not his own part, so he's not completely transformed. He underlines the technical aspect and retains the attitude of someone just making suggestions. Once the idea of total transformation is abandoned, the actor speaks his part not as if he were improvising it himself, but like a quotation. At the same time, he obviously has to render all the quotations overtones, the remarks full human and concrete shape. Similarly, the gesture he makes must have the full substance of a human gesture, even though it now represents a copy. Given this absence of total transformation in the acting, there are three aids which may help to alienate the actions and remarks of the characters being portrayed. Number 1, transposition into the third person. Number 2, transposition into the past. And number 3, speaking the stage directions out loud. Using the third person and the past tense allows the actor to adopt the right attitude of detachment. In addition, he will look for stage directions and remarks that comment on his lines and speak them aloud at rehearsal. He stood up and exclaimed angrily, "Not having eaten," or "He had never been told so before and didn't know if it was true or not," or "He smiled and said with forced nonchalance." Speaking the stage directions out loud in the third person results in a clash between two tones of voice, alienating the second of them, the text proper. This style of acting is further alienated by taking place on the stage after having already been outlined and announced in words. Transposing it into the past gives the speaker a standpoint from which he can look back at his sentence. The sentence, too, is thereby alienated, without the speaker adopting an unreal point of view. Unlike the spectator, he has read the play right through and is better placed to judge the sentence in accordance with the ending,
with its consequences than the former, who knows less and is more of a stranger to the sentence. This composite process leads to an alienation of the text in the rehearsals, which generally persists in the performance too. The directness of the relationship with the audience allows and indeed forces the actual speech delivery to be varied in accordance with the greater or smaller significance attaching to the sentences. Take the case of witnessing addressing a court. The underlinings, the character's insistence on their remarks, must be developed as a piece of effective virtuosity. If the actor turns to the audience, it must be a wholehearted turn, rather than the asides and soliloquizing technique of the old-fashioned theater. To get the full alienation effect from the poetic medium, the actor should start at rehearsal by paraphrasing the verse's content in vulgar prose, possibly accompanying this by the gestures designed for the verse. A daring and beautiful handling of verbal media will alienate the text. Prose can be alienated by translation into the actor's native dialect. Everything to do with the emotions has to be externalized. That is to say, it must be developed into a gesture. The actor has to find a sensibly perceptible outward expression for his character's emotions, preferably some action that gives away what is going on inside him. The emotion in question must be brought out. It must lose all its restrictions so that it can be treated on a big scale. Special elegance, power, and grace of gesture bring about the alienation effect. A masterly use of gesture can be seen in Chinese acting. The Chinese actor achieves the alienation effect by being seen to observe his own movements. Whatever the actor offers in the way of gesture, verse structure, etc., must be finished and bear the hallmarks of something rehearsed and rounded off. The impression to be given is one of ease, which is at the same time one of difficulties overcome. The actor must make it possible for the audience to take his own art, his mastery of technique, lightly too. He puts an incident before the spectator with perfection, as he thinks it really happened, or might have happened. He does not conceal the fact that he has rehearsed it any more than an acrobat conceals his training. And he emphasizes that it is his own account, the actor's account, his own view and version of the incident. Because he doesn't identify himself with him, he can pick a definite attitude to adopt towards the character whom he portrays, can show what he thinks of him, and invite the spectator, who is likewise not asked to identify himself, to criticize the character portrayed. The attitude which he adopts is a socially critical one. In his exposition of the incidents and his characterization of the person, he tries to bring out those features which come within society's sphere. In this way, his performance becomes a discussion about social conditions with the audience he is addressing. He prompts the spectator to justify or abolish these conditions according to what class he belongs to. The object of the alienation effect is to alienate the social jest underlying every incident. By social jest is meant the mimetic and gestural expression of the social relationships prevailing between people of a given period. It helps to formulate the incident for society and to put it across in such a way that society is given the key. If titles are thought up for the scenes, these titles must have a historical quality. This brings us to a crucial technical device, historicization. The actor must play the incidents as historical ones. Historical incidents are unique, transitory incidents associated with particular periods. The conduct of the persons involved in them is not fixed and universally human. It includes elements that have been or may be overtaken by the course of history and is subject to criticism from the immediately following period's point of view. The conduct of those born before us is alienated from us by an incessant evolution. It is up to the actor to treat present-day events and modes of behavior with the same detachment as the historian adopts with regard to those of the past. He must alienate these characters and incidents from us. Characters and incidents from ordinary life, from our immediate surroundings being familiar, strike us as more or less natural. Alienating them helps to make them seem remarkable to us. Science has carefully developed a technique of getting irritated with the everyday, self-evident, universally accepted occurrence, and there is no reason why this infinitely useful attitude should not be taken over by art. It is an attitude which arose in science as a result of the growth in human productive powers. In art, the same motive applies. As for the emotions, the experimental use of the alienation effect in the epic theater's German productions indicated that this way of acting, too, can stimulate them, though possibly a different class of emotion is involved from those of the orthodox theater. A critical attitude on the audience's part is a thoroughly artistic one, nor does the actual practice of the alienation effect seem anything like so unnatural as its description. Of course, it is a way of acting that has nothing to do with stylization as commonly practiced. The main advantage of the epic theater with its alienation effect, intended purely to show the world in such a way that it becomes manageable, is precisely its quality of being natural and earthly, its humor and its renunciation of all the mystical elements that have stuck to the orthodox theater from the old days. Emphasis on sport. We pin our hopes to the sporting public. Make no bones about it. We have our eye on those huge concrete pans filled with 15,000 men and women of every variety of class and physiognomy, the fairest and shrewdest audience in the world. There you will find 15,000 persons paying high prices and working things out on the basis of a sensible weighing of supply and demand. You cannot expect to get fair conduct on a sinking ship. The demoralization of our theater audiences springs from the fact that neither theater nor audience has any idea what is supposed to go on there. When people in sporting establishments buy their tickets, they know exactly what is going to take place, and that is exactly what does take place once they are in their seats. Visualize highly trained persons developing their peculiar powers in the way most suited to them, with the greatest sense of responsibility, yet in such a way as to make one feel that they are doing it primarily for their own fun. Against that, the traditional theater is nowadays quite lacking in character. There seems to be nothing to stop the theater having its own form of sport. If only someone could take those buildings designed for theatrical purposes, which are now standing eating their heads off in interest, and treat them as more or less empty spaces for the successful pursuit of sport. Then they would be used in a way that might mean something to a contemporary public that earns real contemporary money and eats real contemporary beef. It may be objected that there is also a section of the public that wants to see something other than sport in the theater, but we have never seen a single piece of evidence to prove that the public at present filling the theaters wants anything at all. The public's well-padded resistance to any attempt to make it give up those 2 old stalls which it inherited from Grandpa should not be misinterpreted as a brand new assertion of its will. People are always telling us that we mustn't simply produce what the public demands. But I believe that as an artist, even if he sits in strictest seclusion in the traditional garret working for future generations, is unlikely to produce anything without some wind in his sails. And this wind
has to be the wind prevailing in his own period and not some future wind. There is nothing to say that this wind must be used for travel in any particular direction. Once one has a wind, one can naturally sail against it. The only impossibility is to sail with no wind at all, or with tomorrow's wind. And no doubt an artist will fall far short of achieving his maximum effectiveness today if he sails with today's wind. It would be quite wrong to judge a play's relevance or lack of relevance by its current effectiveness. Theaters don't work that way. A theater which makes no contact with the public is nonsense. Our theater is accordingly a nonsense. The reason why the theater has at present no contact with the public is that it has no idea what is wanted of it. It can no longer do what it once could. And if it could do it, it would no longer wish to. But it stubbornly goes on, doing what it no longer can do and what is no longer wanted. All those establishments with their excellent heating systems, their pretty lighting, their appetite for large sums of money, their imposing exteriors, together with the entire business that goes on inside them, all this doesn't contain 5 pennyworth of fun. There's no theater today that could invite 1 or 2 of those persons who are alleged to find fun in writing plays to one of its performances and expect them to feel an urge to write a play for it. They can see at a glance that there is no possible way of getting any fun out of this. No wind will go into anyone's sails here. There is no sport. Take the actors, for instance. I wouldn't like to say we are worse off for talent than any other period seem to have been, but I doubt if there has ever been such an overworked, misused, panic-driven, artificially whipped-up band of actors as ours. And nobody who fails to get fun out of his activities can expect them to be fun for anybody else. The people at the top naturally blame the people at the bottom, and the favorite scapegoat is the harmless garret. The people's wrath is directed against the garret. The plays are no good. The garret is defined as a small room or occupancy within an attic. To that it must be said that so long as they have been fun to write, they are bound to be better than the theater that puts them on and the public that goes to see them. A play is simply unrecognizable once it has passed through this sausage machine. If we come along and say that both we and the public had imagined things differently, that we are in favor, for instance, of elegance, lightness, dryness, objectivity, then the theater replies innocently, "Those passions which you have singled out, my dear sir, do not beat beneath any dinner jacket's manly chest," as if even a play like Vatermord could not be performed in a simple, elegant, and, as it were, classically rounded way. Behind a feigned intensity, you are offered a naked struggle in lieu of real competence. They no longer know how to stage anything remarkable, and therefore worth seeing. In his obscure anxiety not to let the audience get away, the actor is immediately so steamed up that he makes it seem the most natural thing in the world to insult one's father. At the same time, it can be seen that acting takes a tremendous lot out of him. And a man who strains himself on the stage is bound, if he's any good, to strain all the people sitting in the stalls. I cannot agree with those who complain of no longer being in a position to prevent the imminent decline of the West. I believe that there is such a wealth of subjects worth seeing, characters worth admiring, and lessons worth learning, that once a good sporting spirit sets in, one would have to build theaters if they did not already exist. The most hopeful element, however, in the present-day theater is the people who pour out of both ends of the building after the performance. They are dissatisfied. From Mehr guten Sport, from Berliner Bossen Courier, 6 February 1926. Theater for pleasure or theater for instruction? Many people imagine that the term epic theater is self-contradictory, as the epic and dramatic ways of narrating a story are held, following Aristotle, to be basically distinct. The difference between the two forms was never thought simply to lie in the fact that the one was performed by living beings, while the other operates via the written word. Epic works, such as those of Homer and the medieval singers, were at the same time theatrical performances, while dramas like Goethe's Faust and Byron's Manfred are agreed to have been more effective as books. Thus, even by Aristotle's definition, the difference between the dramatic and epic forms was attributed to their different methods of construction, whose laws were dealt with by two different branches of aesthetics. The method of construction depended on the different way of presenting the work to the public, sometimes via the stage, sometimes through a book. And independently of that, there was the dramatic element in epic works, and the epic element in dramatic works. The bourgeois novel in the last century developed much that was dramatic, by which was meant the strong centralization of the story, a momentum that drew the separate parts into a common relationship. A particular passion of utterance, a certain emphasis on the clash of forces, are hallmarks of the dramatic. The epic writer Dublin provided an excellent criterion when he said that with an epic work, as opposed to a dramatic, one can, as it were, take a pair of scissors and cut it into individual pieces, which remain fully capable of life. There is no place to explain how the opposition of epic and dramatic lost its rigidity after having been held to be irreconcilable. Let us just point out that the technical advances alone were enough to permit the stage to incorporate an element of narrative in its dramatic productions. The possibility of projections, the greater adaptability of the stage due to mechanization, the film, all completed the theater's equipment, and did so at a point where the most important transactions between people could no longer be shown simply by personifying the motive forces or subjecting the characters to invisible metaphysical powers. To make these transactions intelligible, the environment in which the people lived had to be brought to bear in a big and significant way. This environment had, of course, been shown in the existing drama, but only as seen from the central figure's point of view, and not as an independent element. It was defined by the hero's reactions to it. It was seen as a storm can be seen when one sees the ships on a sheet of water unfolding their sails, and the sails filling out. In the epic theater, it was to appear standing on its own. The stage began to tell a story. The narrator was no longer missing, along with the fourth wall. Not only did the background adopt an attitude to the events on the stage, by big screens recalling other simultaneous events elsewhere, by projecting documents which confirmed or contradicted what the characters said, by concrete and intelligible figures to accompany abstract conversations, by figures and sentences to support mimed transactions whose sense was unclear, but the actors too refrained from going over wholly into their role, remaining detached from the character they were playing and clearly inviting criticism of him. The spectator was no longer in any way allowed to submit to an experience uncritically and without practical consequences by means of simple empathy with the characters in a play. The production took the subject matter and the incidents shown and put them through a process of alienation, the alienation that is necessary to all understanding. When something seems the most obvious thing in the world, it means that any attempt to understand the world has been given up. What is natural must have the force of what is startling. This is the only way to expose the laws of cause and effect. People's activity must simultaneously be so and be capable of being different. It was all a great change. The dramatic theater spectator says, "Yes, I have felt like that too, just like me. It's only natural. It'll never change. The sufferings of this man appall me because they are inescapable." That's great art. It all seems the most obvious thing in the world. I weep when they weep. I laugh when they laugh. The epic theater spectator says, "I'd never have thought it. That's not the way. That's extraordinary. hardly believable. It's got to stop. The sufferings of this man appall me, because they are unnecessary. That's great art. Nothing obvious in it. I laugh when they weep. I weep when they laugh. And the instructive theater. The stage began to be instructive. Oil, inflation, war, social struggles, the family, religion, wheat, the meat market, all became subjects for theatrical representation. Choruses lightened the spectator about facts unknown to him. Films showed a montage of events from all over the world. Projections added statistical material, and as the background came to the front of the stage, so people's activity was subjected to criticism. Right and wrong courses of action were shown. People were shown who knew what they were doing, and others who did not. The theater became an affair for philosophers, but only for such philosophers as wished, not just to explain the world, but also to change it. So we had philosophy and we had instruction. And where was the amusement in all that? Were they sending us back to school, teaching us to read and write? Were we supposed to pass exams, work for diplomas? Generally, there is felt to be a very sharp distinction between learning and amusing oneself. The first may be useful, but only the second is pleasant. So, we have to defend the epic theater against the suspicion that it is highly disagreeable, humorless, indeed strenuous affair. Well, all that can be said is that the contrast between learning and amusing oneself is not laid down by divine rule. It is not one that has always been and must continue to be. Undoubtedly, there is much that is tedious about the kind of learning familiar to us from school, from our professional training, etc. But it must be remembered under what conditions and to what end that takes place. It is really a commercial transaction. Knowledge is just a commodity. It is acquired in order to be resold. All those who have grown out of going to school have to do their learning virtually in secret. For anyone who admits that he still has something to learn devalues himself as a man whose knowledge is inadequate. Moreover, the usefulness of learning is very much limited by factors outside the learner's control. There is unemployment, for instance, against which no knowledge can protect one. There is the division of labor, which makes generalized knowledge unnecessary and impossible. Learning is often among the concerns of those whom no amount of concern will get any forwarder. There is not much knowledge that leads to power, but plenty of knowledge to which only power can lead. Learning has a very different function for different social strata. There are strata who cannot imagine any improvement in conditions. They find the conditions good enough for them. Whatever happens to oil, they will benefit from it, and they feel the years beginning to tell. There can't be all that many years more. What is the point of learning a lot now? They have said their final word, a grunt. But there are also strata waiting their turn who are discontented with conditions, have a vast interest in the practical side of learning, want at all costs to find out where they stand, and know that they are lost without learning. These are the best and keenest learners. Similar differences apply to countries and peoples. Thus the pleasure of learning depends on all sorts of things, but nonetheless there is such a thing as pleasurable learning, cheerful and militant learning. If there were not such amusement to be had from learning, the theater's whole structure would unfit it for teaching. Theater remains theater even when it is instructive theater, insofar as it is good theater, it will amuse. But what has knowledge got to do with art? We know that knowledge can be amusing, but not everything that is amusing belongs in the theater. I've often been told when printing out the invaluable services that modern knowledge and science, if properly applied, can perform for art, and especially for the theater, that art and knowledge are two estimable but wholly distinct fields of human activity. And this is a fearful truism, of course, and it is as well to agree quickly that, like most truisms, it is perfectly true. Art and science work in quite different ways, agreed. But bad as it may sound, I have to admit that I cannot get along as an artist without the use of one or two sciences. This may well arouse serious doubts as to my artistic capacities. People are used to seeing poets as unique, and slightly unnatural beings who reveal with a truly godlike assurance things that other people can only recognize after much sweat and toil. It is naturally distasteful to have to admit that one does not belong to this select band. All the same, it must be admitted. It must at the same time be made clear that the scientific occupations just confessed to are not pardonable side interests pursued on days off after a good week's work. We all know how Goethe was interested in natural history, Schiller in history, as a kind of hobby. It is charitable to assume. I have no wish promptly to accuse these two of having needed these sciences for their poetic activity. I am not trying to shelter behind them, but I must say that I do need the sciences. I have to admit, however, that I look askance at all sorts of people who I know do not operate on the level of scientific understanding. That is to say, who sing as the birds sing, or as people imagine the birds to sing. I don't mean by that I would reject a charming poem about the taste of fried fish or the delights of a boating party just because the writer had not studied gastronomy or navigation. But in my view, the great and complicated things that go on in the world cannot be adequately recognized by people who do not use every possible aid to understanding. Let us suppose that great passions or great events have to be shown which influence the fate of nations. The lust for power is nowadays held to be such a passion, given that a poet feels this lust and wants to have someone strive for power. How is he to show the exceedingly complicated machinery within which the struggle for power nowadays takes place? Is his hero a politician? How do politics work? If he is a businessman, how does business work? And yet there are writers who find business and politics nothing like so passionately interesting as the individual's lust for power. How are they to acquire the necessary knowledge? They are scarcely likely to learn enough by going around and keeping their eyes open, though even then it is more than they would get by just rolling their eyes in an exalted frenzy. Is the epic theater some kind of moral institution? Well, according to Friedrich Schiller, the theater is supposed to be a moral institution. In making this demand, it hardly occurred to Schiller that by moralizing from the stage, he might drive the audience out of the theater. Audiences had no objection to moralizing in his day. It was only later that Friedrich Nietzsche attacked him for blowing a moral trumpet. To Nietzsche, any concern with morality was a depressing affair. To Schiller, it seemed thoroughly enjoyable. He knew of nothing that could give greater amusement and satisfaction than the propagation of ideas. The bourgeois was setting about forming the ideas of the nation. Putting one's house in order, patting oneself on the back, submitting one's account is something highly agreeable. But describing the collapse of one's house, having pains in the back, paying one's account is indeed a depressing affair. That was how Friedrich Nietzsche saw things a century later. He was poorly disposed towards morality, and thus towards the previous Friedrich, too. The epic theater was likewise often objected to as moralizing too much. Yet in the epic theater, moral arguments only took second place. Its aim was less to moralize than to observe. That is to say, it observed, and then the thick end of the wedge followed, the story's moral. Of course, we cannot pretend that we started our observations out of pure passion for observing and without any more practical motive, only to be completely staggered by their results. Undoubtedly, there were some painful discrepancies in our environment, circumstances that were barely tolerable. And this not merely on account of moral considerations. It is not only moral considerations that make hunger, cold, and oppression hard to bear. Similarly, the object of our inquiries was not just to arouse moral objections to such circumstances, even though they could easily be felt, though not by all the audience alike. Such objections were seldom, for instance, felt by those who profited by the circumstances in question, but to discover means for their elimination. We were not, in fact, speaking in the name of morality, but in that of the victims. These truly are two distinct matters, for the victims are often told that they ought to be contented with their lot for moral reasons.
Moralists of this sort see man as existing for morality, not morality for man. At least it should be possible to gather from the above to what degree and in what sense the epic theater is a moral institution.